Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We're jumping straight into a really classic philosophical argument.
Right, from ancient Athens. We're looking at Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, using the Jowett translation mainly.
Imagine stepping back in time. You're in Athens at the house of Callias, who was pretty wealthy.
And the place is buzzing, absolutely buzzing, because the big star of the show, Protagoras, the famous sophist, is visiting. Maybe a bit controversial, too.
Yeah, definitely. And he's got this crowd around him, eager young guys wanting to learn, but also some pretty sharp thinkers ready to challenge him.
Including Socrates, of course.
Naturally. So our mission for this deep dive is to really get into this core question, one that's, stuck around for centuries. Can virtue actually be taught?
That quality of being, well, a good person, a good citizen, can you learn that like you learn geometry?
Exactly. We're going to track the arguments. Protagoras, who's pretty confident he can teach it, and Socrates, who's, well, famously skeptical.
And hopefully pull out some key insights, because honestly, wrestling with this old question, it helps us think about some really fundamental stuff today.
Like how character gets formed. What's education really for?
Yeah, and what does it even mean to be, good or wise now?
Okay, so let's set the scene properly. Imagine you're there with Socrates. It's really early, before dawn even.
Oh.
And there's this frantic knocking on his door. Bang, bang, bang.
Who is it at that hour?
It's this young man, Hippocrates. He's wide awake, totally buzzing with excitement.
Oh, okay. What's got him so worked up?
He wants to become a student of Protagoras. More than anything. He's ready to go right now.
You can feel that youthful energy, can't you? Just wants to dive in.
But Socrates, being Socrates, kind of taps the brakes.
Of course he does.
He makes Hippocrates stop and think, like, hold on. What exactly do you expect Protagoras to make of you? What kind of person are you hoping to become?
That's a good question. Not just what will you learn, but what will you be?
And this leads Socrates to this really striking analogy. He compares these sophists, these teachers of wisdom, to merchants.
Merchants selling what, though?
Food for the soul. Knowledge,
Oh,
basically.
good. I like that. Food for the soul.
But here's the catch, the warning. Unlike buying, say, bread or wine for your body.
Right. You can take that home, maybe get it checked out before you consume it.
Exactly. You can take it home in a pot, ask a doctor, is this safe? But knowledge, or what someone claims is knowledge, the moment you pay for it, the moment you hear it and accept it, it goes straight into your soul.
No inspection period, no returns counter.
None. It could potentially harm you immediately, and you can't just, spit it out unless you yourself are a physician of the soul and know how to judge it.
That's a really powerful warning. Be careful who you learn from.
Seriously. And then, right on cue, Protagoras makes his entrance. Quite the figure.
And he makes his big claim. He says he's different from other teachers who sort of hide what they do.
Yeah, some call themselves poets or mystics or even gym teachers to cover up being sophists.
But Protagoras says, nope, I'm a sophist, loud and proud, and maybe even more shocking back then, he's the first one to openly say, yes, I charge for teaching this.
He demands pay. And what he promises Hippocrates is pretty huge.
What's the pitch?
He says, stick with me, and day by day, you'll become a better and a wiser man. Specifically, you'll get prudence in affairs private as well as public.
Okay, so personal life management and public speaking.
And acting. He says Hippocrates will be able to speak and act for the best in the affairs of the state. He's basically claiming to teach political excellence and personal goodness.
Wow, that is a bold promise. Socrates must have something to say about that.
Oh, he does. He admits it sounds like a noble profession, if it's actually possible.
Yeah.
But then comes the doubt.
The big can it really be taught question.
Exactly. Why is Socrates skeptical? He lays out two main points.
Okay, what's the first one?
It's about how the Athenian assembly actually works day to day. He says, look, when the city needs to, say, build a wall or some new ships.
Technical stuff.
Right. Who do they listen to? They call for the experts. Builders, shipwrights, engineers. Those are the guys who get the floor.
And if some random person who isn't a shipwright tries to give advice on shipbuilding...
They get laughed at or even shouted down, told to sit down.
Yeah.
There's a clear sense that for those things, you need specialized, learned knowledge.
Makes sense.
But then, Socrates points out, when the topic shifts to managing the state, to big political decisions.
The stuff Protagoras claims to teach.
Precisely. Suddenly, anyone can get up and speak. Cobblers, blacksmiths, merchants, rich guys, poor guys. Everyone's allowed to say.
And nobody stands up and says, hey, where did you study political virtue? Who was your teacher?
Never. It's as if, Socrates suggests, the Athenians themselves, by how they act, don't actually believe political virtue is a specialized skill you learn from a teacher.
That's a sharp observation. Their own democratic practice seems to contradict Protagoras' claim.
It really does. And his second point, it hits even closer to home for the Athenian elites listening in.
Okay, what is it?
Socrates basically asks, if this virtue, this political wisdom and goodness is teachable, then why do the very best, the wisest, most virtuous citizens seem to fail at teaching it to their own sons?
Ooh, that's pointed. He names names.
He does. He brings up Pericles, the great Athenian leader. Widely admired, right?
Absolutely. The statesman.
But what about his sons, Perillus and Xanthippus? Socrates implies they didn't exactly inherit their father's political greatness, despite presumably having the best access to him.
Right. And weren't they known for other things but not statecraft?
Exactly. And he also mentions Cleinias, a young ward of Pericles. Pericles sent him away to be educated by someone else, Ariphron, because he was worried about him.
And how did that turn out?
Apparently, Ariphron sent him back after just 6 months. Couldn't make any progress with him.
Wow. So Socrates' point is,
if virtue was teachable, like, say, playing the lyre or riding a horse, wouldn't the most virtuous men, like Pericles, be the best teachers?
and wouldn't they make absolutely sure their own kids learned it successfully?
You'd think so. The fact that they often seem unable to pass on their specific virtue suggests maybe it's not something you could just transfer through instruction.
That's a powerful challenge. A real 1-2 punch against Protagoras' whole enterprise.
Definitely. So Protagoras is on the defensive. How does he respond? How does he argue that, yes, actually, virtue can be taught?
Well, Protagoras is, he's a master orator, right? He doesn't just dive into logic immediately. He says, okay, I'll prove it, but first let me tell you a story, a myth, an apologue.
Okay, using a myth. Interesting tactic. What's the story?
It's a creation myth. Basically, the gods task Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus with equipping all the creatures they just made.
Right, Epimetheus means afterthought, doesn't he? Doesn't sound promising.
Exactly. He messes up. He gives out all the good stuff, fur, claws, wings, speed to the animals. And by the time he gets to humans, the cupboard is bare. Humans are left naked, shoeless, defenseless.
Oh, dear. So Prometheus has to step in.
Yes, forethought. He feels sorry for humanity, so he steals fire from the heavens, and also the technical arts craftsmanship, building, farming, the skills associated with the gods Hephaestus and Athene.
Okay, so humans get tools and fire, survival skills.
Right, the means of life.
Right.
But, crucially, they still lack political wisdom. They can build houses, but they can't build communities. They keep fighting and scattering.
Ah, so that's the missing piece. How do they get that?
That comes from Zeus himself. He sees humanity as going to wipe itself out without the ability to live together peacefully. So he sends Hermes, the messenger god, down with two crucial gifts, justice and reverence, or eidos and dike. Basically, the core political virtues needed for social harmony.
Okay, justice and reverence, and how are these distributed?
Here's the key difference Protagoras highlights. Unlike the technical arts, which Prometheus gave out unevenly, some people got medicine skills, some got building skills.
Right, not everyone needs every technical skill.
Exactly. But Zeus tells Hermes to give justice and reverence to everyone. They must be shared by all humans, because a city can't exist unless everyone participates in these virtues.
Oh. So that's Protagoras' mythical answer to Socrates' point about the assembly.
Precisely. Why does everyone get a say in politics? Because Zeus decreed that everyone should have a share of the necessary political virtues. It's divinely mandated universal participation.
Clever use of myth. But okay, that's a story about a divine gift. How does he turn that into an argument that virtue is taught by humans?
That's the pivot. He says, okay, let's move from myth to how society actually works. Look around you. Our practices prove we believe virtue is acquired and taught.
How so? What's the evidence?
First, he points out that everyone is basically required to at least claim they have virtue.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If you admit you're, say, a terrible flute player, people might just shrug or find it honest. No big deal.
Right.
But if you go around publicly saying, oh yeah, I'm totally unjust, I have no sense of right and wrong, people would think you're crazy. They'd say you're unfit for society.
That's true. It's like a basic social expectation. You have to pretend, at least.
Exactly. Society expects everyone to possess some degree of justice and reverence. Their absence isn't seen as just lacking a skill, but as a kind of madness or moral defect. This implies it's something everyone should have acquired.
Okay, that's one point. What else?
His second and probably stronger argument is about punishment. Why do we punish people who do wrong?
For justice, retribution.
Protagoras says no, that's not the rational basis for it. We don't punish like an angry animal lashing out just because it was hurt. We punish, he argues, for the sake of prevention.
To stop it happening again.
Yes, to deter the offender from repeating the crime, and just as importantly, to deter others by making an example.
Okay, and how does that show virtue is teachable?
Because, he says, this kind of preventative punishment only makes sense if you believe the behavior can be changed. You don't punish someone for being, say, ugly or short or weak.
Right, those are seen as misfortunes of nature, things you can't help.
Precisely. But we do punish injustice, impiety, cowardice. Why? Because we believe these are things that result from a lack of teaching or bad habits or insufficient practice. We believe people can learn to be just, pious, brave. Punishment, in this view, is society's way of trying to teach or correct that lack. It's a form of forceful instruction.
That's a really interesting way to frame punishment as education almost.
It is. So, armed with these arguments, the universal expectation of virtue and the educational purpose of punishment, he then circles back to tackle Socrates' tricky point about the sons of good men.
Yeah, the Pericles problem. If virtue is taught, why can't the best guys teach their own kids effectively?
Protagoras says Socrates is looking at it the wrong way. Virtue isn't like a specific craft skill, like pottery, that a father possesses and can just hand down directly to his son in a workshop.
Okay, so what is it like?
It's more like a fundamental requirement for the whole society to even exist. It's a quality everyone needs to have, to some degree, for the state to function. Therefore, the teaching isn't done by just one person.
So who is the teacher?
Everyone, the whole community. Parents teach children, nurses teach them, tutors teach them, the laws teach them, the poets teach them, the public assemblies teach them. Just by living in a civilized society, you are constantly being taught and reminded about justice, temperance, piety.
It's like learning your native language. You just absorb it from everywhere.
That's a great analogy. And this leads to his own famous analogy, the flute-playing city.
Right, tell us that one.
He says, imagine a city where, for some reason, survival depended on everyone being a decent flute player. Just hypothetically.
Okay, a city of flautists.
In that city, wouldn't everyone be constantly teaching flute? Parents nagging their kids to practice, neighbors correcting each other's technique, laws perhaps mandating flute lessons.
Yeah, it would be everywhere, all the time.
Now, would the son of the best flute player automatically be the best player in the next generation?
Not necessarily, no. Talent varies, effort varies.
Right. The son of a great player might be mediocre, and the son of a terrible player might turn out quite good. But, Protagoras argues, wouldn't everyone in that city be a vastly better flute player than someone who grew up in a place with no flute teaching at all?
Absolutely. Even the worst player in Flute City would probably be better than a complete novice.
Exactly. And that's his point about virtue. We live in Virtue City. Everyone is teaching it, constantly. So yes, the sons of virtuous men like Pericles might not reach their father's heights, but they still benefit immensely from this constant societal instruction. Even the most unjust person raised in Athens, Protagoras claims, is probably more just than a savage raised without laws, customs, or education.
So the baseline is raised for everyone.
Right. And people like him, the sophists, they're just the specialist coaches. Society provides the basic training, and he provides the advanced, expert instruction for those who want to excel.
That is a remarkably thorough and clever defense. He's basically co-opted Socrates' own observations about society to support his case.
He really has. And Socrates is apparently quite impressed. He says something like, okay, Protagoras, you've made a great speech. I was doubting virtue could be taught, but you've almost convinced me.
Almost.
But then he adds, I just have one small difficulty remaining.
Haha, classic Socrates. Okay, here we go again. What's the small difficulty this time?
Socrates wants to shift gears. He says, okay, let's assume for a moment virtue can be taught. But what is virtue? What is its nature?
Moving from teachability to definition.
Exactly. He asks Protagoras, are the different virtues we talk about, justice, temperance or moderation, holiness or piety, wisdom, courage, are they all separate things?
Like different parts of a face. An eye is not an ear, a nose is not a mouth. They all make up the face, but they have distinct functions that aren't really like each other.
That's the analogy Socrates offers. Are they distinct like that? Or are they really just different names for the same underlying thing, like pieces of gold, all the same substance, just shaped differently?
How does Protagoras answer that?
Protagoras goes for the first option. He says, yes, they are distinct parts, like the parts of a face. A person can possess one without possessing the others.
For instance.
He says you can find people who are courageous, but also unjust, or people who are just, but maybe not very wise. So they seem separable.
Okay, that seems like a common sense view.
It does. But it's the perfect setup for Socrates' method, the dialectic. Time to test this claim for consistency.
Let the questioning begin. Where does he start?
He picks two virtues, justice and holiness, or piety. He asks Protagoras, is justice a holy thing or an unholy thing?
Well, Protagoras has to say it's holy, surely.
He does. Then Socrates asks, and is holiness a just thing or an unjust thing?
Again, seems obvious. It has to be just.
Right. So Socrates pushes, if justice is holy and holiness is just, are they then not very similar? Are they perhaps even the same sort of thing?
How does Protagoras handle that?
He gets a bit slippery. He agrees they are similar, perhaps very nearly the same, but he resists saying they are the same. He throws out this counter. Well, everything is sort of like everything else in some small way, isn't it?
Trying to muddy the waters.
Yeah. But Socrates pins him down, saying surely the similarity between justice and holiness is much, much stronger than, say, the similarity between justice and, I don't know, a random rock. Protagoras has to concede the point, but you can tell he's a bit reluctant.
Okay, so justice and holiness are looking pretty close. What next?
Socrates moves on to wisdom and temperance, or self-control, moderation. He asks Protagoras about their opposite. What's the opposite of wisdom?
Folly.
Ignorance.
Folly, yes.
Yeah.
And what's the opposite of temperance?
Folly again. Or maybe intemperance. But folly seems to fit. Acting without moderation often seems foolish. Socrates uses folly, aphrosuna, as the opposite for both. Then he brings in a logical principle. Everything has only one true opposite.
Ah, I see where this is going.
If folly is the opposite of wisdom, and if folly is also the opposite of temperance, and there's only one folly.
Then wisdom and temperance must actually be the same thing, just different names for it.
Exactly. Protagoras apparently sees the trap closing. The text says he agrees, but with great reluctance.
You can really picture him getting uncomfortable here. He started out so confident, saying the virtues were all separate parts of a face. Now Socrates is showing deep connections between them.
He is indeed. And Protagoras' frustration starts to bubble up. He tries to shift tactics. He wants to go back to making a long speech, which is his preferred style, his strength, or he suggests maybe they could discuss a poem by Simonides instead, analyze its meaning.
Ah, trying to get off the hook of the short Q&A.
Totally. But Socrates digs in his heels. No way.
And this leads to that famous bit in the dialogue about how philosophy should be done, right?
Yes, the interlude. Socrates insists that for a real philosophical discussion, a genuine search for truth, they need to stick to brief questions and answers. Dialectic, not rhetoric.
He contrasts discussion with making an oration.
Right. And he famously dismisses analyzing poetry in this context. He says it's like the kind of entertainment people resort to when they can't actually converse intelligently themselves.
Ouch. Why?
Because you can't ask the poet, hey, what did you really mean by that line? The poet isn't there, and even if they were, their meaning is always open to debate. It doesn't lead to clarity in the same way direct, logical questioning does.
So sting to the argument at hand.
Exactly. Engage with each other's ideas directly. Don't hide behind interpreting someone else.
Was there a bit of chaos then? Did others jump in?
Oh, yeah. Sounds like quite a scene. Callias, the host, tries to smooth things over. Alcibiades, who is Socrates' young admirer, jumps in to defend Socrates' debating skills. Critias urges them both to be fair. Prodicus, another sophist, known for making superfine distinctions between words, gives a little lecture on the difference between proper argument and mere wrangling, between esteem and praise, gratification and pleasure.
Always the word nerd, Prodicus.
Yes. And then Hippias, yet another sophist present, suggests they appoint an umpire or referee to control the length of their speeches and keep things orderly.
How did Socrates react to that? An umpire for philosophy.
Socrates rejects the umpire idea but proposes a compromise. He says, okay, how about we take turns? Protagoras can ask him questions for a while if he keeps them reasonably brief. Then they can switch back.
And the audience acts as informal judges.
Sort of. They agree that the group will try to ensure both speakers stick to the point and maintain a conversational style. Protagoras agrees, and so the philosophical discussion resumes.
Okay, so back to the main event. The nature of virtue. Where were they?
Protagoras had just reluctantly agreed that wisdom and temperance might be the same. and justice and holiness were very similar. He's regrouped slightly.
Does he change his position?
He modifies it. He says, okay, maybe those four, justice, temperance, holiness, wisdom, maybe they are pretty similar to each other. But he digs his heels in on the last one, courage.
Ah, courage. He insists that one is different.
Very different, he claims. And his proof is the same one he offered before. Look around. You can find many men who are thoroughly unjust, unholy, intemperate, even ignorant, but are undeniably brave. Extremely courageous, in fact.
That seems plausible on the surface, doesn't it? We can all think of examples, maybe from history or fiction, of the brave villain type.
It does seem plausible, so Socrates has to tackle courage directly. How does he do it?
Let's hear it.
He starts by asking Protagoras, do courageous men and cowards go towards the same things or different things in, say, a battle?
Different things, surely. Cowards run away from the danger, courageous men go towards it.
Right. Cowards go where there's safety, courageous men go where there's danger, or at least so men say, as Socrates puts it. But then Socrates brings back a principle they agreed on earlier, or perhaps just a fundamental Socratic idea. No one willingly pursues what they genuinely believe to be evil or harmful to themselves.
Right. People always aim for what they think is good, even if they're mistaken.
Exactly. So if facing danger involves potential harm, pain, fear, things generally considered evil, why would the courageous person willingly move towards it while the coward flees it?
They must perceive the situation differently.
That's where Socrates leads him. The difference isn't that one desires evil and the other desires good. Both desire what they perceive as good overall. The difference lies in their estimation or knowledge of what is truly dreadful and what isn't.
Also,
the coward flees because they estimate the immediate danger, the potential pain or death, as the greatest evil in that situation. Their fear overrides any other consideration. They lack a proper assessment.
okay. And the courageous person?
The courageous person, Socrates suggests, also recognizes the danger. But they have a better understanding, a better measurement of the situation. They might see that facing the danger, despite the risk, leads to a greater good like honor, saving comrades, defending the city, or avoids a greater evil, like shame or enslavement.
So courage isn't about ignoring danger, but about correctly assessing it in the bigger picture of goods and evils, pleasures and pains.
Precisely. The courageous person doesn't think the danger itself is good, but they judge that facing it is the better, less evil, or more ultimately beneficial course compared to fleeing. They have a superior knowledge or calculation of the likely outcomes.
Wow. So courage isn't just guts, it's a kind of wisdom about risk and reward.
And that's exactly the link Socrates makes. What is it that allows someone to correctly judge what is truly fearful and what isn't?
Knowledge, wisdom.
Yes. Wisdom is knowing what is genuinely dangerous and what isn't, what leads to overall good, more pleasure, less pain, and what leads to overall evil, more pain, less pleasure. What's the opposite of that knowledge?
Ignorance. Not knowing what's truly dangerous or not.
Right. Now, what's the opposite of courage?
Cowardice.
And what did we just say cowardice seems to stem from?
Ignorance of what's truly fearful. A bad calculation.
Exactly. So if cowardice is ignorance about dangers and courage is the opposite of cowardice, then courage must be
Knowledge about dangers. Knowledge of what is and is not to be feared.
bingo. Socrates leads Protagoras right to that conclusion. Courage, the virtue Protagoras thought was most separate and distinct, turns out to be fundamentally linked to knowledge, just like the others seem to be.
How does Protagoras take this? Is he convinced?
The text suggests he assents, but maybe reluctantly or even silently at this point. Socrates' logical steps have kind of cornered him into admitting courage, knowledge. He didn't want to go there, but the argument leads him there.
It's an amazing piece of reasoning. But Socrates doesn't stop there, does he? He pushes this connection between virtue, knowledge, and pleasure and pain even further.
He does. This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit controversial. He asks Protagoras point blank, is pleasure the only good? And is pain the only evil? Basically proposing a form of hedonism.
How does Protagoras answer that? That seems like a radical idea.
Protagoras is cautious. He backs away from a simple yes. He gives the more conventional answer, the common view. Well, some pleasures are good, but others are bad, like indulging in something harmful. And some pains are evil, but others can be good, like enduring painful medical treatment.
Right, that sounds like common sense. You weigh the consequences.
Exactly, but Socrates isn't satisfied with the common sense view on the surface. He wants to know the reason behind it. He asks, why do we call those painful things like medicine or hard exercise or going to war good.
Because they lead to a good result later. Health, victory, less pain in the long run.
Precisely. They lead to greater pleasure or avoidance of greater pain eventually. And why do we call pleasant things, like excessive drinking or eating, evil?
Because they lead to bad consequences. Hangovers, illness, greater pain down the road.
Right again. So Socrates argues, when you drill down, even the common view that says some pleasures are bad, some pains are good, is actually using the net balance of pleasure and pain as its ultimate standard for judging good and evil. Things are called good because they produce more pleasure than pain overall, and evil because they produce more pain than pleasure overall.
He does that clever dialogue within a dialogue thing here, doesn't he? Imagining arguing with the many who hold the common view.
Yes, he shows that if you press the average person on why they call things good or bad, their justification ultimately seems to boil down to the expected consequences in terms of pleasure and pain.
Okay, so if, for the sake of argument, we accept that good, pleasure, and evil, these are pain, in terms of the net balance.
Yeah.
What does that do to the idea of being overcome by pleasure?
This is the core of it. People often say things like, I knew it was wrong bad, but I did it anyway because I was overcome by the pleasure of the moment.
Yeah, happens all the time. Weakness of will. Akrasia.
Right. But Socrates says, if good just is pleasure and evil just is pain, then saying I did evil because I was overcome by pleasure becomes logically weird.
How so?
It's like saying I chose this net painful outcome because I was overcome by the prospect of this net pleasant outcome. Or even more starkly, if we substitute the terms, I chose evil because I was overcome by good.
Phrased that way, it sounds nonsensical. Like saying, I chose the lesser good instead of the greater good because the lesser good overwhelmed me.
Exactly. It doesn't make logical sense if the only scale is maximizing good, pleasure, and minimizing evil, pain. Why would you knowingly choose the worst option on that scale?
So if it's not that pleasure literally overpowers our knowledge of what's better, what is the explanation for making bad choices?
Socrates concludes the problem isn't our knowledge being defeated by pleasure. The problem is a lack of knowledge in the first place.
The lack of knowledge. How? People often say they knew better.
They thought they knew, perhaps. But Socrates introduces the idea of an art of measurement, or a science of calculation. He says choosing correctly between different pleasures and pains requires skill.
What kind of skill?
The skill to accurately weigh them up. Pleasures and pains differ in intensity, duration, and importantly, proximity, how near or far they are in time. A small pleasure right now often looks bigger than a large pleasure far in the future. A small pain later might seem insignificant compared to avoiding a tiny discomfort now.
Like perspective with vision. Things look smaller farther away.
Precisely that analogy. He says we need an art, a science of measurement, to correct for these distortions of appearance, to calculate the true value of different courses of action in terms of their overall pleasure-pain consequences.
And this art of measurement, that's what knowledge is.
Yes, true knowledge is this ability to measure correctly and thus choose the action that genuinely leads to the greatest good, net pleasure, or least evil, net pain.
So when someone says they were overcome by pleasure, what they really mean, in Socratic terms, is
They mean they acted out of ignorance. They lacked the art of measurement. They miscalculated. They chose the seemingly greater pleasure, which was actually lesser overall, or failed to appreciate the magnitude of the future pain. Their choice wasn't a failure of will against knowledge, but a failure of knowledge itself.
wow. So being overcome by pleasure is just a misleading way to say, I was ignorant of the true balance of good and evil.
That's the radical conclusion Socrates reaches in this part of the argument. Vice, or acting badly, stems from ignorance specifically, ignorance in this art of measuring pleasures and pains.
Okay, bring it all home. How does this connect back to virtue being knowledge?
Well, if all wrong action, all vice, stems from this kind of ignorant miscalculation of pleasure pain, then what prevents wrong action?
The opposite of ignorance, which is knowledge, that art of measurement.
Exactly. And what do we call the state or quality that leads to right action and prevents wrong action?
Virtue.
So virtue must be knowledge. Specifically, this knowledge of how to correctly measure goods and evils, pleasures and pains, to always choose the best course.
And this applies to all the virtues, even courage.
Especially courage, as they discussed. Courage is knowing what is truly fearful, leading to more painless pleasure overall, and what isn't. Temperance is knowing how to calculate pleasures now versus pains later. Justice. Well, the link is maybe less explicit here, but presumably involves understanding the balance of goods for oneself and the community. They all seem to boil down to this core knowledge.
So the argument drives towards the unity of virtue, They're all just different facets of this master knowledge, this science of good and evil.
That seems to be the conclusion of Socrates' argument here.
Which leads to that really fascinating, ironic twist at the very end of the dialogue.
Yeah, it's quite the reversal.
Socrates started the whole conversation by expressing strong doubts that virtue could be taught at all. Remember his points about the assembly and Pericles' sons?
Right, he was the skeptic.
But where does his own line of argument end up? It leads him directly to the conclusion that virtue is knowledge.
And knowledge is, almost by definition, the sort of thing that can be taught. It's the prime example of something teachable.
So Socrates, the initial doubter of teachability, ends up arguing for a position, virtue is knowledge, that makes virtue seem eminently teachable.
While Protagoras...
He started out supremely confident, absolutely insisting that virtue can be taught. That was his whole profession.
Yeah, his big sales pitch.
But throughout the argument, especially about the unity of virtues and the nature of courage, he kept resisting the idea that virtue is simply knowledge. He wanted courage, at least, to be something different, something non-rational, perhaps.
So Protagoras, the initial champion of teachability, ends up resisting the very definition of virtue, as knowledge, that would most strongly support his claim that it can be taught.
It's a complete flip. Socrates calls it a terrible confusion. They've ended up arguing for each other's initial positions, in a way.
It really highlights the complexity of the issue and maybe the limits of that particular discussion.
Socrates actually wants to continue. He says, look, to sort this out, we first need to figure out definitively what virtue is. Once we know that, then we can properly address whether it's teachable or not.
But Protagoras has had enough for one day, it seems.
Yeah, he praises Socrates' earnestness and skill in argument, but politely declines to continue the inquiry right then. He basically says, let's talk another time.
And so the dialogue ends not with a final neat answer, but with this fascinating tangle and a call for further investigation.
Absolutely. So if we zoom out, what's the journey we've taken in this deep dive?
Yeah.
We started with Hippocrates' simple wish, make me a better citizen.
Then we heard Protagoras' confident claim that he could do just that, backed by his myth and arguments about society teaching virtue constantly.
Followed by Socrates' sharp challenges. Why doesn't society act like virtue is taught? Why can't good people teach their kids?
Which forced Protagoras into that brilliant defense about universal teaching and his flute player analogy.
But then Socrates shifted, didn't he, from if it's taught to what it is.
Leading us through that dialectical examination of justice, holiness, wisdom, temperance, and finally courage.
And culminating in that really provocative exploration of pleasure, pain, and the art of measurement.
Which led to the conclusion, at least within Socrates' argument, that virtue isn't just a feeling or separate qualities, but is fundamentally knowledge, and vice is fundamentally ignorance.
So what are some key things for you, the listener, to maybe take away or chew on?
Well, Protagoras' idea that society itself, through its norms, laws, and expectations, is a primary teacher of virtue that's powerful. Even if we don't fully agree, it makes you think about cultural transmission of values.
And Socrates' final argument, that link between virtue, knowledge, and a kind of rational calculation of pleasure and pain that's startling. It challenges our usual ideas about willpower and emotion in ethics.
The idea that maybe when we act badly, it's not because our desires overpowered our reason, but because our reason itself failed, we lack the knowledge, the art of measurement, to see the truly better path. That vice is ignorance.
It certainly doesn't give you a simple checklist for being good, but it forces you to question your assumptions about what goodness is, what courage is, even what learning is.
It really shows the power of philosophical questioning, to unpack ideas we use every day without maybe thinking too hard about them.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. If Socrates is onto something, if virtue really is a kind of knowledge, does that change how you think about ethics?
Does it make becoming a better person seem more like learning a complex skill? Less about wrestling with desires and more about refining your understanding, your ability to measure what truly matters?
Or do you think something crucial is missing? Is there more to character than just knowing the good, however rationally calculated that knowing might be? How does this ancient equation, virtue is knowledge, vice is ignorance, sit with modern ideas about psychology, emotion, and ethics?
What part of this ancient debate stands out most to you?